Welcome to Stoa. My name's Caleb Ontiveros.
Hi, everyone. I'm Michael Tremblay.
And today we're going to be talking about frequently asked questions and Stoicism. The very first question is, who should I read first? All right, what's your take on that, Mike?
Yeah, woohoo, let's jump into it. Exciting with these questions because it's like, things that people want to know, things that we hear a lot about. So the first one is, what Stoic should I read first? I'm going to have a bit of a controversial take maybe, but I'm going to provide some context. When you first get into Stoicism, there's a lot of kind of introductions, Ryan Holiday, Massimo Pigliucci, like there's these kind of introductions, Donald Robertson to Stoicism. And then people naturally say, okay, well, I've kind of read about it. I want to actually read it, but some of the works, you have these older translations, you have these confusing writings. You want to engage with it, but you don't know where to start. The big three Roman Stoics are Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus. And they're the most famous because they're the ones that we have the most writing of. We actually have a lot of what they have said has been preserved, which is lucky. The earlier Stoics, the founders of Stoicism, lived 300 years before these guys. But we've lost what they said. We lost what they wrote, except for some fragments, except for some pieces that have been preserved. So when you're thinking about where to start, it's usually going to come down to one of these three people. And I know a lot of people. I know the most famous is Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I know a lot of people like that. I know that was one of the ones that was recommended to me. But where I recommend people start actually is with Epictetus. And I recommend that they start with Epictetus's handbook. And my reason for that is there's a couple reasons I have for that. First, the handbook is really, really short. It's about I'm looking at this now in this Everyman's copy that I have, actually about 20 pages, right? So it's not deep or not long. Doesn't require a big time commitment. The other thing that's valuable about Epictetus is that Epictetus was a teacher. So I know a lot of people love Marcus Aurelius, and I think there's a lot of value to his writing, right? I think it's great. But Marcus Aurelius is an advanced practitioner. He's an advanced Stoic writing to himself, right? The Meditations is a series of self-reflections, a series of notes he provided himself only for the purpose of himself. It wasn't intended for wider readership. And so when you dig into Epictetus' handbook, which is kind of a 20-page summary of his key lessons, you're getting the greatest hits. You're getting the greatest hits presented by somebody who's writing for students, who's writing for people who maybe don't find Stoicism intuitive, who maybe need some clarification, who maybe disagree. And that's what I really like about it. And that's why I think it's the best place to start. And then if you dig into Epictetus and you like it, you'll like the rest of it. And you can commit more time and dig more into it, but then you'll also have a strong foundation. You're not as likely to have kind of misinterpretations as you can sometimes have reading other Stoics. The other big one is Seneca's Letters on Ethics. I love this one, but as you can see, I'm holding up a copy for those listening. My edition is 600 pages. So it's a huge commitment, right? It's a lot to sit down and read a 600-page book when you're looking to start, you're looking to dig into it. And so that's why for me, it's Epictetus' handbook. But interested to hear what you have to say about this, Caleb, what your thoughts are.
Yeah, well, there's always a question of who's asking. So if you've read a little bit of maybe some modern Stoic and you're thinking about which of the ancient Stoics should I start with first, there may be one answer. And then for people who have heard very, very little of Stoicism, apart from maybe just a clip, YouTube video, or a friend told them about something, perhaps the answer is slightly different. I mean, at least for me, I found the Meditations to be the most powerful and interesting. So I did read Epictetus actually while taking an undergrad course, but reading him, it didn't strike me as an important philosophy, just given the place where I was at in life. Which isn't so much a knock on Epictetus by any means. I came to Stoicism through reading Nassim Taleb's Anti-Fragile. he mentions Seneca a decent amount, and then from there going to Seneca and Marcus Aurelius. And it was the meditations that stuck out to me, and who I'd happily refer people to one of the modern translations of that work.
Yeah, that's something worth clarifying too, is that translations make a difference. I think when you're starting your journey, you're asking, who should I read first? I think you should prioritize readability over accuracy. I think what's important is that you expose yourself to as much of the thinking as possible. And then you're going to be in a better spot once you've read a lot of Stoicism. You're going to be in a better spot anyway to discuss kind of questions of accuracy or interpretation or things like this. But I think sometimes people, I know I read this online, and people jump right into these kind of, 1800s translations that they can get for free. And they're like, this is terrible. Why did these people write this way? And it's like, well, they didn't write this way, right? They were writing in Latin or ancient Greek, but this was kind of the style of translation back in the day, 100 plus years ago. I'm a bit interested in what piqued your interest in Marcus Aurelius, because I think, as you said, it really comes down to the individual. Because for me, Epictetus was the first person I read, and I just fell in love with his way of writing. It was like a total shock to the system. And I know people get that experience with Marcus Aurelius, and I value Marcus Aurelius as a thinker and as kind of a historically significant practitioner of Stoicism. But it never had kind of that same kind of emotional, intuitive appeal that Epictetus did for me. So I'm interested in what Marcus Aurelius, why he appealed to you so immediately.
Marcus Aurelius just has a number of aphorisms that stuck out to me. He has a sort of laconic, almost cryptic at times, writing style, and the topics range from specific ways that people have influenced him, to what are probably paraphrases of Epictetus, to some reminder about how to manage people, to even much larger sort of philosophical summaries on how he views his place in nature. So that large range, where so much of the language is designed to carry the message specifically, one gets a sense that Marcus Aurelius either chose these phrases that he heard from elsewhere or wrote them himself so that they would be maxims he could remember and use them in practical life. So whether it's a reminder, like at some point you will have forgotten everything, later everything will have forgotten you, or something of that nature. These sorts of phrases are something one can return to in one's ordinary life.
Yeah, so maybe if Epictetus was writing for students, and that's the appeal on my end, Marcus Aurelius was writing in like as punchy a way as possible. I'm conscious that there's no love for Seneca here. I think Seneca's great. I really do value, and I don't think you can go wrong picking up any of these. I just think that there is a certain punchiness, as you said, in Marcus Aurelius. There's a certain punchiness, there's a certain maximization of the ability to remember these things, the ability to act on these things. And then Epictetus' style is just meant to kind of jolt people out of their comfort zone. And so I think those are much more, I think both of those can be a bit more inspiring or a bit more motivating first reads when you're getting into it.
I would say that if you're looking for something more systematic, then Epictetus makes the most sense, because neither Seneca and certainly not Marcus Aurelius are that systematic by the way of presentation. So in a sense, if you're looking to understand Stoic philosophy, going to Epictetus first would be ideal. If you're looking for letters on specific situations, like how to manage time, then you might go to Seneca. If you want notes on how a specific person incorporated these ideas into his life, then Meditations is the place to go.
Yeah, that's a good way of dividing it. Great.
One interesting question, or one question I have for you, is whether there is if you remember a specific passage that jumped out to you.
One of the first things I remember about reading about Epictetus that kind of jumped out to me, there's obviously the dichotomy of control, which is really interesting, but I remember the example of the person who had to hold the chamber pot, you know, I think this is the thing that people go to the bathroom in, and this kind of like person who was in a low down position and had to clean these or move these around or work a very kind of embarrassing job, basically. And I remember there's this passage Epictetus is talking to this person. Yeah, Epictetus basically says in this conversation is either like do it or don't do it, but don't do it and complain about it. You know, like either you're above that kind of work, in which case you say no and you suffer the consequences, or you're not above that kind of work, in which case you do it and you reap the benefits of being paid, and you face the consequences of doing something that's maybe embarrassing or maybe kind of lower social standing. And that the thing that jumped out about that, it's kind of a funny story, but the thing that jumped out about that to me was that call for kind of consistency, that call for that idea of you know,
Mm-hmm.
don't do something and then complain about doing it, or be upset that you're the kind of person that does it, or you know, be frustrated about your situation that made you make this choice that you then made. It was this idea of, you know, again, something now years later is very intuitive to me, but this idea of like, you've been dealt your cards, pick the card that is most suitable to you, that seems the most appropriate to you, but don't spend this time whining about the hand, whining about the card that you've been dealt. And in a way, that's an actualization of the dichotomy of control. But that was just so striking for me. Because again, it's not just abstract philosophy. It's about practical action, and it's about the way that you relate to the practical action. So the effect that has on your happiness and your perspective. And you know, and Epictetus just has this way of talking where he just, you know, makes it sound so obvious, or makes it sound like the idea that you were kind of ruminating on this problem is the silly part. And what matters is kind of the action or how you confront it. That's what stood out to me.
Yeah, that's a great example. He just has so many stories like this, whether it's that one or noting Helvidius Priscus, who, you know, he believes his role is to be a senator, and whether he's threatened with being exiled or execution, you know, does not matter. He's chosen to be a senator, and he will face the consequences of doing that, performing that role excellently.
Yeah, there's also there's the athlete who, I can't remember for what reason, but has to, you know, is faced with the choice of, you know, getting basically their genitals amputated, and the athlete's like, no, I'm an athlete. I care about my body. I'd rather choose death than be like physically mutilated in this way, which is always a bit, you know, these cultural examples. There's another one about the beard. You'll kill me before you like shave off my beard because I'm a philosopher. There's these kind of cultural specificity to these stories, but they're always this point about, you know, be consistent, walk the walk, figure out who you want to be and be it, right? I think that's Marcus Aurelius. You know, waste no more time thinking about what a man should be, and like what you know, what kind of man you should be, and be one, or be that person. That was very confronting and very different than the other kind of philosophy I'd read in school, which was very about, we're going to spend a lot of time worrying about what type of people we should be. We're going to spend a lot of time worrying about ethics and very little time worrying about actually acting well, or, you know, personal transformation.
For me, I always love the line from Marcus Aurelius, very short, just that the universe is transformation, life is opinion. That's a very sublime way to capture Stoic philosophy. Our next question is then, what is really in our control?
Yeah, this is a juicy one. I really like this one. I wrote a paper about this, or a piece about this for Modern Stoicism blog. And this is one we get all the time. And I think one of the most common misunderstandings. And so the dichotomy of control in Stoicism, it's one of the first things you learn. And it's presented with this view of, you know, some things are in your control, some things aren't in your control. You should care about the things that are in your control. You shouldn't care about the things that aren't. And it really, really naturally leads to a lot of these, like, people naturally go, well, okay, that's all good and fine, but what's in my control and what's not in my control, right? And people will say, and then you end up with all these kind of like more deep concerns about it, because people will say, well, you know, your beliefs are in your control, and people will respond, well, no, it doesn't seem to me like I can change what I believe. You know, it doesn't seem to me like I can change what I think, or how you act is up to you. And people will respond, well, you know, it seems to me like, you know, There's parts of my behavior that, are either genetic dispositions or ways that I grew up or ways that I now kind of just like respond to situations. Like people naturally kind of want to push and pull on this concept of control. It's one of the most common questions I see online is people saying like, what about this? Is this in my control? What about this? Is this in my control? And so to answer that question, first, you really need to understand the terms that we're talking about here when the dichotomy of control is presented, because the dichotomy of control is, I would say, about 80% right the way it's presented. And it's presented that way because it's easily understood. Anybody can snap to it and understand it immediately. But the real concept that the Stoics use, I think, is better translated as up to us. And when you go back to the Greek, they talk about up to you. They don't use a word for control. Mm-hmm. They use a word that is means like determined by you or up to you. And so the key concept for Stoicism is not one of control, because control is this ability to, I think we define control as this ability to either immediately determine something, in which case it's like, no, your beliefs are not in your control because you can't immediately determine your beliefs or immediately think differently or act differently or immediately not be angry. Your emotions by that criteria aren't in your control. Or we think of control as the ability to like strongly influence. We say LeBron James controls the basketball game. And what we mean is that like, he really sets the pace. But that's not strong enough either, right? Because we wouldn't want to say, the Stoics wouldn't say that the outcome of a soccer game or basketball game are in your control. So this idea instead is I really think people should drop this idea of control and switch to this idea of up to you. And it's a little bit more complicated. It's a little bit harder to explain to non-Stoic, but it's much more robust. And what's meant by up to you is this idea that, do you determine it? Are you causally responsible for it? And what is meant by that is, can anyone else but yourself stop it from happening? Right? So if I make a decision, if I decide to, walk across the street, that decision is up to me. Nobody can stop that decision. That decision is caused by me. It's determined by me. Nobody else can stop me from making that decision. But my ability to actually walk across the street, that can be impaired by a cliff, by a wall, by three people holding their arms together and not letting me by, right? So my ability to actually walk across the street is not up to me, but my decision is up to me, right? And so when we think of up to me, it makes a lot more sense than trying to think of these things in terms of control. And then so the question is not really what's really in our control. The question is really what is up to us. And as Epictetus says, what's up to us is really the faculties of our mind, the way that we think, the decisions we make, our emotions, the choices we make, the way that we respond to situations. These are the things that we determine. These are the things when something happens, we say, well, who was responsible for that? Who was responsible for your anger? Who was responsible for your choice? The Stoics are going to say that's you. That's up to you. And so on one side, the upside of thinking about things as up to you is it removes this confusion around control. The other upside to this is it allows this sense of kind of moral transformation and personal improvement that takes place over time, right? Because the thing that you hear is like, when you begin to study Stoicism, you hear, well, anger's in your control. And somebody very intuitive is like, well, anger doesn't feel like the kind of thing that's in my control at all. It seems like the Stoics don't really know what they're talking about, right? But they don't say anger's in your control. They say anger's up to you. Anger is the kind of thing that you're responsible for, that you create, not the external situations. That's kind of your thought processes, your decisions. We just did a podcast, you and I, Caleb, on Stoicism and emotions, and we talked a lot about how anger is determined by our judgment, by the way we think about things. These extreme emotions are caused by the way we relate to situations. And that's why the emotions are up to us, because they're being produced by the way that we think about the situation. Likewise, the way that we believe things, the way that we act when confronted with a situation, these are all things that are up to us. They're things that we have to shape over time as we strive towards self-improvement. Our character, the quality of our character, our virtue or vice, that's something that's up to us. but it's not something we control in the sense of I can't immediately snap my fingers and become a good person, but it is something up to me. It is something that I'm tasked with becoming a good person over the course of my life. So that was a bit of a long answer. But to wrap that all up, the idea is what's really in our control doesn't really matter to the Stoics. What matters is what's up to us, and what's up to us are these things that are the result of our choices, the choices themselves, and the results of those choices. So things like the decisions we make, our emotions, the quality of our character, the way we treat other people, the way we think about ourselves, these kinds of things. These are the things that are up to us. And that's how you should apply and think about the dichotomy of control in a more robust way.
So how does this manifest when it comes to beliefs? It seems like someone might say that it seems like beliefs are just something I have when the world appears to be a certain way. I can't, in what sense is my belief that I have been harmed or the sun is bright up to me as opposed to external influences?
Yeah, I'm going to really nerd out on this one because I think it's a really good question. So Epictetus uses this term, which is the proheiresis, which is our faculty of choice, right? And for him, really, that's the thing that's up to us. And what's included in faculty of choice, our faculty of choice, our proheiresis, is the ability to reflect on a situation, the ability to make a decision about that situation, and the result of that decision, be that an emotion, be that desire to do an action. That's really, on Epictetus's account, what's up to us, just those three primary faculties. I was giving more particular examples before, but it's those three primary types of things. So again, to reflect on to reflect on something, to make a decision about it, and then the results of that decision, to form a judgment and the results of that judgment. So when you say belief is the result of the judgment. So to provide an example, someone insults you. I think these examples are always really easy and they're really kind of emotionally charged. Someone insults you. We don't have a belief yet, right? We just have a situation. And we can play that out because, if it's a stranger on the street, it's your best friend that you've known for years. It's a person that you've hurt and maybe has the right to insult you. Depending on the situation, you're going to look at that situation very differently, right? So all you have is an event, somebody that's said words to you. That's the impression. That's the first part of this link that leads to kind of emotions and judgments and thoughts. That impression is not up to us. Somebody can honk their horn and they can put an impression in our brain. We don't control the impressions that come in. What we control, or what's up to us, is what we do with them. So then we reflect on that impression. We say, wow, I'm really angry that person said that, or we're just joking around, or maybe I deserved it, so I'm not angry. We reflect on it, we form a judgment, and then that judgment leads to an emotion or behavior or a decision. So beliefs are come after reflection. Beliefs come after judgments, right? Impressions are not beliefs. Impressions are kind of these sensations. Beliefs are things that we've believed, we've assented to. They're actions. They're things we've had a choice in. So on that view, of course, our beliefs are up to us because our beliefs are things that we have participated in. They're choices, they're actions. Impressions, the kind of the way that the world is initially presented to us, that's not up to us. People can do that. People can force that on us. But these beliefs are things that we participate in.
So what do you say about the case where it just seems essentially difficult to make a particular judgment? I think the insult case is very useful and practical. And the Stoic view seems clearly true there. But maybe there are other cases where you look at the sun and you have natural beliefs about the sun, the sky, the sun's brightness, or perhaps in other emotionally charged cases, something especially tragic happens and you just naturally respond to that situation and feel like, where did you play a role in this?
Yeah. So I think that I think that's where the distinction between up to you and in your control becomes important, right? Because I think what you're saying, Caleb, or as I'm understanding you, is it seems really clear to me that there's some things that I don't feel like I'm very much participating in. Something tragic happens and I just get upset. I don't feel like I'm deliberating like a scientist removed from that situation, right? Or I look at the sun and I think, wow, there is a sun there. I'm not really like it becomes kind of input, like the way that I would explain it using the Stoic model of the mind is it becomes kind of input output. The impression comes in, it moves right through the machine, the belief comes out. There's two things you would say to this. Is first, you would say, yeah, you're right. That doesn't really seem like it's in your control. And you're right that in a kind of a meaningful sense, it's not in your control. But what it is it's up to you because you're the one that kind of controls that machine, that judging machine, that reflecting machine. You're the one that's kind of built it over time. So if you're saying, I'm the kind of person where if I see a house, I just think that's a house. If I see a sun, I just think that's a sun. What that's telling you is that you've built a judging machine that's not very skeptical. That's not very reflective. And what you want to do is then over time, you want to practice refraining judgment. You want to practice your skeptical skills and kind of change that machine. So instead of something coming in and a belief coming out, the impression comes in and it stays there. It doesn't output the belief, right? And that's up to you to cultivate and develop that change, right? That's a result of and if you're not doing that, that's still the result of you. That's still up to you. It's just not what you want. With the examples of grief, right? We think we don't feel grief in a vacuum, right? We have tons of beliefs about what matters to our lives, who these people are, what the situation is. And it's like, yeah, if you being who you are, confront that situation, you're going to have the same output every time, right? Or a similar output because you have a certain beliefs coming into that situation and you have a certain kind of skill set at reflecting and judging. You have a certain kind of level of progress as a Stoic. And once again, yeah, you don't have full control over that situation. You don't have these full kind of mental skills yet, but those skills are, nothing is being caused by the impression. Nothing is impossible for you to kind of, change over time, I would say. And it's in that sense that the responsibility, the up to you-ness, the causality is placed on you, not on the event itself.
Yeah, absolutely. The way I think of the dichotomy of control is in terms of, what two kinds of things are under your control, and one initial, in a first pass at that, are there just two kinds of things: decisions and your reflective judgments. One can decide to do nearly anything, whether that decision reaches its aim is quite often not entirely under your control. We have the common analogy of, you are the archer and you can guide the arrow to your best ability. But if something unusual happens, the target moves, there's a sudden unpredictable gust of wind, that sort of thing is out of your hands. And then reflective judgments, I think the model of what the sort of input output idea is, you are what is in between that, and that you can shape that machine, as it were, or you can shape yourself to have a sort of character to believe particular things or not believe particular things in any given situation. And that's a lifelong project. It's something that takes time. It's less like decisions in the sense that it feels like one can make nearly any decision in the moment, and more a matter of slowly shaping yourself into a kind of person who has true beliefs.
Yeah, I think that's really well put. I really, really like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and grounding that as you do in your identity, what you fundamentally are, is the next step. Why is this sort of thing? Why are these two things out to me? It's because this is what I am as a rational and social being.
Yeah, we could spend a whole episode on the dichotomy of control. Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's the two parts of that. There's the up to, and then there's the you. So you're bringing in both a conception of what it means for something to be up to something. And then you're also bringing in a conception of what you are. And yeah, if you don't identify yourself with your mind exclusively, or if your identity isn't tightly linked to your beliefs, your behaviors, your choices, then we might lose some of that. But that's a really important part of that for the Stoics. When you evaluate someone, when you judge somebody, you're judging them on the quality of their beliefs, their decisions, and their choices. You're judging them on the quality of their character because that's what they are. They are, as you said, a rational being, a decision-making thing, right? And a decision-making thing is good when it makes good decisions and bad when it makes bad decisions. I think this really naturally leads into our next question.
So our next question is a very common one. What is virtue? Stoics and, of course, many other ancient philosophies center around this idea of virtue. And it's not a word that is used perhaps as much as it used to be in the English-speaking world, and it's a word that might have somewhat different connotations than the Stoics imagined it as possessing. So it's always important to be clear about this, especially since it's sort of the ultimate aim, if you will, of the Stoics' life is to cultivate virtue. And the closest analog to virtue in the English language is probably character. So virtue is traits that someone may have. You could think of it almost as firmly ingrained habits. You can describe someone as being conscientious, thoughtful. These are parts of their character. And virtue specifically is excellent character, not just any kind of character trait. It's the character traits that humans are supposed to have and what make us excellent. So in the most abstract sense, or perhaps not the most abstract sense, but a rather abstract sense, virtue is character, specifically good character.
Yeah. And if I can provide some context around virtue too, to flesh that out more, because I think that's dead on. When you say virtue is good character, that's what is virtue for the Stoics, which is an important distinction. Because virtue, the Greek word is arete, and the Aristotle and Plato and all these Greeks that came before the Stoics that were talking about this, they would talk about the arete of, anything like inanimate objects, right? It meant the excellence of something, right? So you could have the arete of a car, right? You could say the virtues of a car is to go really fast. My car is excellent because it goes very fast and I can control it quite easily and it looks nice on the outside. And people could disagree about what the virtues of a car were. They could say, no, I think what's important for a car is that it has great gas mileage. And you can have kind of a disagreement. But you're talking about what it means to be a great car. And people would all, say, a car that doesn't run is a bad car. You could all kind of agree on a lack of virtue too, or things that would be vices, right? And so it's the sense of excellence. And then that excellence with the car example, right, is defined by what the thing is. So what it means to be an excellent car is very different than what it means to be an excellent knife, which is very different than what it means to be an excellent person. And as you pointed out, for the Stoics, what it means to be an excellent person, what it means to have virtue in the context of a human being is to have good character. It's not to be athletic. It's not to be physically attractive. It's not to be even kind of socially adept or anything like this. It is to do the right things, to act the right ways, actualizing, their four cardinal virtues. And so when you think of virtue in this ancient Greek sense, again, to summarize that, it's this overall excellence. And then it's like virtue of what? Well, virtue of a person. And then people would disagree about what that means. For the Stoics, they go, no, virtue of a person is something very small. As you already said, Caleb, it's these traits of character. It's these ingrained habits. It's these ways of acting. That's what the Stoics are talking about when they're talking about virtue. So it's not really like a very abstract it's not a very abstract, elitist, removed thing as it might sound when you first hear virtue. Like, how good of a person are you? How when we measure you, when we size you up as a quality of a human being, what we measure then is we measure your virtues, we measure your character traits. We don't measure something else. So that's the kind of so that's the kind of contextual history that Stoicism provides a distinct answer to, which I think is still, in my opinion, I think the right way of thinking about it.
Yeah, and then there's the question, okay, what character traits are good? And of course, there's the four classical or four cardinal virtues of courage, justice, self-control, and wisdom. Sometimes people might call self-control moderation or temperance, or wisdom has a very distinctly practical element. We're concerned about practical wisdom. But nonetheless, those are the four concerning how you treat others and justice, what sorts of things you avoid or fear and what you do not avoid and fear, and courage, how you relate to your desires and self-control. And then finally, how your picture of the good and of the world sort of comes together into a character that one could ideally describe as wise.
I think the thing about the four virtues is they're manifestations of the same thing, right? So they're like they're different ways of talking about the same thing, and the thing that they're talking about is knowledge, right? Virtue at the end of the day is knowledge. And then you can say knowledge of what? Well, in some cases, it's knowledge, as you said, of what to avoid, not to avoid. And we call that kind of knowledge courage. Sometimes it's knowledge of, what to desire, not to desire, or how to moderate those desires. And we call that self-control. But at the end of the day, with the Stoics, all of these things are conceived of as, all of these virtues are just different types of understanding of the world and understanding how to navigate the world. And that comes back, that sounds counterintuitive to people, because a lot of times people think of like, well, courage is something that I train up or I develop over time. It's like a muscle. It's not knowing. I know that I should be able to stand up to, I know that I should be able to do what scares me when it's good, or stand up to people that are cruel or unusual, but I can't. I have that knowledge. But for the Stoics, again, they have that kind of input-output machine, right? Like that kind of that way of looking at your mind as this reflective, something that reflects and judges these impressions that you have. And they're like, if you really understood what to do in the situation, you would come to the right judgment and you would act in the right way. So the person that acts well is just the person that knows what to do and really thoroughly understands that, not knows it in kind of a propositional sense, not I could write in a test, oh, I should act this way, but really understands why they should act that way and their values align with that and they know why they have those values. But that's the kind of crystallization of perfect virtue in the form of the sage, the ideal individual. And then these other ones you were talking about are these like, they're just ways of talking about that when you apply it to different situations. And so that's why sometimes people talk about like virtue is knowledge. And then, then we have these different virtues. They're all just these types of knowledge, these ways of talking about knowing and understanding.
And that helpfully answers the question, are these the only four virtues? And the answer to that is, well, virtue is really only one thing, knowledge, but it has many different handles, or there are many different things one can be knowledgeable or not about. So although these are, I think, a very useful initial classification, there are, of course, other ways of talking about virtue, and one can think about virtues that might be neglected from the classical four.
Yeah.
That being said, this isn't the sort of situation where one can pick out any possible traits and label it as a virtue. There are real constraints on what counts as a legitimate virtue, and that main constraint being, is it the sort of thing that is aligned with what is true? Does that character trait properly help one pursue knowledge.
Yeah, great. And the other thing that, again, there's so many different ways we can tackle this, but another thing that I wanted to hit on with virtue, so there's this constraint of trueness, right? It's not like there's this constraint of trueness. You can't just say, you can't just call anything a virtue. There is real right and wrong in Stoicism, which is nice. It's not this like it's not subjective. There is this kind of there's some ambiguity in situations that you need to kind of evaluate individually, but there is a clear conception of right and wrong and a better and worse way to act. If you value something, for example, that doesn't have value, or you ignore something that does have value in the pursuit of something else. I mean, that's very abstract, but if you sell off your family for $10, Stoics are going to say, well, you've put money on a bit of a pedestal there. You've made kind of a knowledge mistake, right? Or you, again, going back to easy family examples, you're not able to be a good parent, or you're not be able to do your job well. You're not able to fulfill, a kind of beneficial role in society because, your desires take control of yourself, whether that's, something like gambling, or this inability or, a need for possessions. They're going to say, look, like you're lacking this kind of moderation. You have a distorted view of what matters in life. Another thing that I want to say about virtue, we could almost do another episode, I'm realizing now, about Stoic contradictions or Stoic paradoxes. Because another thing about virtue, we talk all about virtue, but one thing that the Stoics think is that virtue is all or nothing, right? Virtue is like something like straightness. And the Stoics will say, look, you can't be more or less, like straight as in like, not a curved line, like a straight line. You can't be more or less straight. That straight is like the state of being this perfection, right? And virtue is the same way. You either have it or you don't. And people will say, what do you mean you have it? Like, clearly there's some people who are more virtuous and some people who are less. And they make this analogy to the individual drowning, right? And they say, look, whether your head is below the surface by an inch or you're at the bottom of the ocean, both people are equally drowning. And that's the way that's the way that they talk about virtue. And the reason for that can sound very elitist. It can sound kind of demoralizing. But the reason for that is that virtue is knowledge, right? So you cannot be courageous without also having a knowledge, without also possessing the other virtues, without also having the other ones at the same time, right? So, somebody who's like robbing a bank and not afraid of getting shot, they're not displaying courage, but lacking temperance or moderation, right? They're actually lacking courage because they're doing something without fear, but they're not kind of embodying knowledge, like a kind of holistic knowledge as they do that. That's kind of an interesting thing, but then that doesn't really change us as people that are progressing, us as people that are trying to be better people. But it's this helpful thing that even though you can think of this knowledge as being, or these virtues as being divided, they really do interconnect. And if you try to like become more courageous in a vacuum, or you try to become more self-controlled without a conception of why you're trying to be self-controlled or what the purpose of it is, you can't really develop virtue in that way. They have to be interconnected. They have to be being developed together because they all kind of connect in the same knowledge. What do you think about that, Caleb?
I think the idea that virtue is unitary is correct. And often people make the mistake of picking out a trait they in isolation find admirable about a given person and perhaps overestimating the character of that person just because they have one specific trait that is admirable when that trait is misused. So a common example might be if you admire the political skill of a particular politician. Well, is that really so valuable? Well, that depends on all the other traits that the politician has on their ends. And admiring something like political skill by itself is a mistake. It's in a real sense, not latching onto the right thing that matters.
Yeah, totally. It's not excellence in terms of how a human being should be excellent, right? Because when you think of virtue as excellence, it's a political virtue. It is excellence in terms of the job, right? The same way somebody can be excellent as a doctor at a certain skill set. It's a medical virtue. But human virtues, being an excellent person, you can't take something in isolation. Has to always be interconnected with the rest of being a good person.
So we've covered 3 questions, and at this point are running into the limits of time as well as technical issues. So we might call it there. We covered what Stoics you should read first, what is really under your control, and the nature of virtue, which seems like a good list for about 45 minutes.
All good things to know. Yeah.
All good things. Excellent. Chat soon.
Great. Thanks, Caleb. Thanks.